Good morning. Welcome to Coffee Time with Masterminds. When we started this show, we thought that COVID was going to be a temporary interruption and that we'd be returning to business as usual in a few weeks. But it's been 11 weeks now that we've been talking about leaders' roles in navigating through this crisis. And now we realize that we might not be going back to business as usual. Maybe we're navigating into a new normal. But today we are finally talking about returning to the office. And our guest, Dr. Jackson, will take us through his experience of returning to work. But before I introduce our hosts and guests, I want to thank everyone for joining us last week for our conversation about the myth of self-care. We got a lot of engagement and emails and conversation after production. We understand that this is an important topic and that people are really interested and engaged with it. And we're committed to returning to this topic in the next few weeks. So we'd like to invite you to come back and bring us your thoughts about self-care, structural care, and keeping ourselves whole and well as we do important work. If you'd like to be a guest on that show, please say something in the comments or send us a message because we would love to have you on. So for today, go ahead, grab yourself a cup of coffee and sit back, prepare to join us for our half-hour conversation about the issues that are urgent to leaders of mission-based organizations. Let's start with introductions. Please tell us your name and where you're joining us from in the comments. And throughout our conversation, we invite conversation in the chat. I am Peta Blakely. I am the founder and principal of Blakely Consulting, and I help mission-based organizations measure and maximize their impact. I'm joined today by Cynthia and Rebecca. Good morning,
Hi.
Rebecca. How are you?
I'm well. Good morning, Peta. How are you? Good morning, Cynthia.
Hi.
I'm Rebecca Tuttle. I'm the founder and creator of Grant Right Now and Grant Writing for Good. We help schools, nonprofits, organizations, and businesses find, write, and secure grant funding, and we teach you how to do it.
And Cynthia?
Hi, everybody. I'm Cynthia. I am principal and founder of a management consulting firm, To Your Growth, and I specialize in change management, organizational development, and leadership development. Thank you.
Benjamin and Ellen say good morning. They have coffee cups in hand, ready to go.
All right.
Thanks for joining us. So finally, we're talking about opening our doors and going back to work. A few weeks ago, we started searching for nonprofits who are opening their doors, and we couldn't find any who were already doing so. So we're excited to have Dr. David E. Jackson with us today. Dr. Jackson is a curriculum writer and leadership trainer at the Jack McDowell School for Leadership Development at the Salvation Army in Atlanta, Georgia. He's also the lead pastor at the Rock ATL International Fellowship. In addition, Dr. Jackson is CEO of D.E. Jackson Enterprises, a coaching ministry and consulting firm, and has authored 3 books where he combines his 2 passions, ministry and leadership. Welcome to our show, and thank you so much for joining us.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's such a pleasure to be with you ladies today.
Thank you. So let's start at the beginning. The Salvation Army is a global ministry that provides an array of social services around the world. What were the initial days of shelter in place like for the Salvation Army?
Because we are a service organization and a ministry, it was very difficult. It was very difficult to have to separate ourselves from those that we serve and from our fellow colleagues. And we really didn't have a plan, as many organizations and nonprofits didn't really have a plan, because COVID-19, this global pandemic, is something that we've really never seen in our lifetime, most of us.
That's right.
So our initial days were really spent coming up with an action plan for how we were going to still be able to conduct business and serve our constituents, but yet keep our employees safe. So the first few days was a lot of what everyone stay home at first until we figure out what we're going to do. So for several days we were home and we were introduced or reintroduced to the world of Zoom meeting as one of many video types of meetings. And from there, the Army was able to pull together a plan for how we would function. One of the things I do note is that I had asked before, could I telecommute? I particularly enjoyed remote work. And I was told no, because we don't do that in the Salvation Army. But interestingly enough, in the midst of our shelter in place, they developed a telecommuting protocol. And so that's a good way to describe the beginning of our sheltering in place. We really didn't know what to do. They quickly gathered, and things that were not previously able to be done
Possible. Yeah.
was interestingly now able to be done.
So what's it like going back to the office? Is there a back to go back to, or is this just a whole new working situation now?
Mm.
What a wonderful question. Going back has been very strange because what used to be would never be anymore. And so we're having to chart a new path. For instance, I work at the training college for the Salvation Army for the Southern Territory, and I work particularly in the School for Leadership Development. And a lot of my work is in the field working with the officers and their staff, doing different types of organizational leadership trainings. So now that travel has been restricted, we're like, okay, well, let's shift all of our training online. And so we're engaging in various ways to present our content digitally. Interestingly enough, a lot of our constituents who are requesting training do not want us to conduct the training online. They still want us to come in person.
Huh.
Really?
There's three things that you said, and I thought, oh my gosh, we just talked about that on the last show. We just talked about that show. You know, it's really interesting because in the last show, we were talking about if we aren't accessible to open our doors for clients to come in as they usually had, there's a little bit of a mourning or a sadness there for clients because they go to your nonprofit or to your organization because they find comfort in going to the physical space itself.
I totally agree. And not only is it grieving for those who come to the space, it's grieving for those who we service outside of the space. And if we are not able to go to them and to provide what we have always provided, then it causes a range of emotions, which I think speaks to the reality that when you reopen, it may be sending signals to your clients that we are reopening as we once were, even though we all know there's a new norm. I think subconsciously people assume that the reopening also means that the rules of engagement and the level of service and the way in which the service was provided is going to be the same. So it's this dual tension, I think, for people in their mind between we know things are not the same, but we assume that they are.
You know, people are seeking comfort in going back to something that's familiar, and it is doubly traumatic to have that expectation not be realized.
How are you communicating
think,
with people that they can't come back to the same way they once knew? How do you communicate that with them?
I think you have to take into factor what you all are saying, that there is a psychological, emotional, mental aspect to reopening. But you also have to keep people in the truth, because one of the jobs of leaders, one of the jobs amongst casting vision is keeping your organization and those you serve in the truth. And so you have to tell people honestly that, you know, things are going to be different, but you cannot do it so, you know, matter-of-factly that you disregard the fact that people are looking for comfort and are looking for security, and you reopening and you re-engaging with them in some ways is providing some succor. And so one of the things I know we have done in our office is we allow people to express how they feel about the changes. And so I think creating an empathetic space for people to share how they feel has helped them to at least feel like they got a chance to express, but also be heard. So we listen to them, we validate their experiences, and then we try to work together with them to say, okay, so this is where we are, this is what we can provide, this is what you're saying that you need, and in many instances, there's some gaps. Let's work together, let's co-create, kind of using Judith Glaser's language from conversational intelligence, let's co-create a path forward. So I think a part of it is versus organizations trying to determine the path forward, it may be helpful to co-create that path forward with those that you serve. And so that way you not only give validity to their concern, but you also get some engagement from them, which would then produce buy-in to the new norm.
Mm.
I have a question. So take us through the first day, because when you and I were talking a couple of weeks ago, you were like, Sin, I didn't even know where to park. And you go into the office. Tell us what that was like. Like, what was the human interaction like the first day or two?
It was so awkward, to be quite frank. I mean, you're right. I didn't know where to park. They sent us this long email because we had to all go to the campus nurse to have our temperatures taken, fill out this survey. Then they was like, you can't go to your office first. You have to go to the nurse first. Well, for me, the nurse's office is above our school where we are housed. And so when I pulled in the parking lot, when I finally figured that out, all my colleagues are waving because we haven't seen each other in like months. David, hi, David. I was like, hi, but I can't come to you all yet because the email said I have to go to the school
I
nurse.
can't believe you.
So it was so hard. And so I went to the school nurse. And so not to go to all the narrative, but, so you have all of these rules you have to follow. You don't want to break the rules because you want to respect the rules. My boss is a senior. She's advanced in age. She's been a Salvation Army officer for over 40 years, now retired, but still serving. And so we wanted to be respectful of her health because she's in one of the high-risk populations. Her husband has some pre-existing conditions. So we all had to wear masks, of course, but we could not really talk to each other. So we were having meetings in our offices on Zoom. I'm like, this is ridiculous. I might as well be at home. Like, it's no different than being at home. We should just be at home, but we had to come to campus. And so we're in our office, doors are closed, mask on, having meetings, having to engage each other through our computers. We could not engage each other in person. It took us like almost 3 weeks before we could actually have a meeting in the same space.
Wow.
So it's just very difficult, especially if you have a highly relational team and a highly connectional team, which we are. It's just difficult to not be able to stand in the hall and talk or go into conference room and engage and reconnect. So it was just a very awkward time. And it's still very awkward because we're still trying to figure out how we are to relate and do our work in this new reality.
And it sounds like a lot of the benefit, as you said, the benefit of coming to the office is creating community in the office, right? It's not our individual workstations, it's the conference rooms, it's the coffee pot, it's the ways that we come together in that space. And trying to maintain physical distancing in the space is making you rethink the purpose and use of the space.
No, I think you're absolutely right. Yeah, community building is so important, especially if during the shelter in place time, your boss or your director or whoever was very intentional about communicating and connecting with the team. Then, of course, one of the things we were looking forward to in our return was that community, those spaces by which we can engage in community building, especially with such a lengthy gap of time of being able to engage in those type of practices. For us, we remained very connected up until we were furloughed, and we were furloughed for about a month and a half, so we could not technically communicate about work, but we definitely look forward to that community, which speaks to what we were discussing earlier. Not only are those we serve looking to reconnect, we are looking to reconnect amongst ourselves, but with these restrictions, it limits that. So it also creates a grief within your team. And so those who are considering reopening or preparing to reopen, you must think about how you manage grief amongst your employees as well as your constituents.
Wow.
You're a leader. I mean, this is amazing. You've really taking not just a policy approach with how can we protect ourselves with the pandemic and the reopen, but you're really genuinely leading people and their struggles with this, the emotions that go with this. What an impressive leader. I wish you were my leader.
Wow, you're very gracious.
Well, coming up in my career, it was always policy, meeting, that human element is so necessary, like you're saying, especially now, and you just do that so gracefully. amazing leadership. Amazing leadership.
Yeah. Well, thank you. In times like this, we need empathetic leaders. We need emotionally intelligent leaders, because when people are facing a crisis they've never had to endure before, you cannot just be policy. It cannot be black and white. You have to have a heart element. I take a part of this because I'm also a pastor, and I've had to do the same thing with my church. I had just launched my church in January, and then 3 months later, no church, and everything has had to be digital. So I think being aware of people's feelings and their realities, being concerned about their families and how their families have been impacted by this, being concerned about people's emotional, mental well-being, their physical well-being is essential if you're going to be successful in the business arena. And we find through a lot of research that leaders who are concerned with people's well-being and not just their productivity tend to have highly productive teams and high morale amongst their teams as well.
That's what we're starting to find out. You know, one of the interesting things was that I was with David when the US decided that we were in the pandemic. And so I remember David saying, "Oh wow, I don't have a church," meaning a building to go into. You remember this? And so I
I
think the
remember.
next day I had asked you, "How are things going?" And you said, "I have people taking care of that." And I say that because Coffee Time was started because so many leaders and so many of us were just focusing on the day to day, that truly a leader's job is to think ahead. And what you did was put the right people together to figure out how we're going to bring the church to the internet. And you were able to then continue your work in leadership, which I thought was impressive to watch, because we had a couple of people. I was with a group, and we had a couple of people dealing with emergencies, and I got to observe how Dr. Jackson led through the initial moments of hearing, "Oh wow, we're shutting down. We're shutting down." That was a tough week.
Yeah.
It was indeed a tough week, and it just speaks to, I believe that transformational leaders are very invested in developing leaders, not
Yeah.
just followers. And so for the Salvation Army at the college, as well as at the ministry, it's very important that I'm raising up leaders and empowering people to lead. And you really see how important that is in times like a pandemic, where I get a call saying the space that you use has been shut down by the government, and our equipment is also in that space. That was my reality. And here I am in Florida. My church is in Atlanta. I was able to pick up the phone and make a few calls to some of my leaders, and they said, "Dr. Jackson, don't worry about it. It is handled." And I knew I could trust their words, because I know that I have invested hours upon hours of mentoring, coaching, walking alongside. Because one of the things about leadership is never removed from management. I forget who I heard say that recently. It was so profound. But they were saying that some people assume that when they become leaders, they no longer have to be a manager. And there is a distinction, but you never leave being a manager if you're a good leader, because you cannot expect what you don't inspect. So if you're not aware of what's happening in your organization, how can you expect to get a result? And so because I employed these principles with my leaders, with my executive leadership team, I was able to trust his words that it would be handled. And surely it was handled, and it freed me to be focused on my residential studies.
Okay. So another conversation we've had recently that I got very interested in is the difference between adaptation and innovation. And you and I were having a conversation, and you were saying that that's another area where leaders really need to know the distinction and then decide which way they're going to go. And innovation is definitely the better way. Tell us again, what are the differences and why does it matter?
So for me, to adapt, both innovation and adaptation are responses to changes. So there is a change, that is something that has been presented to the organization that tells the organization that you can no longer function as you had previously. So you have to make a shift. You have to do something different. Adaptation normally, and when you look at the word etymologically or at its root, it means to fit around or to shape around. But when you look at the word innovation etymologically, it means to make new or to do over. And so when you adapt, you're simply consoling or concealing around the change. Oftentimes, with a temporary mindset or posture, we're going to adjust with the hopes that things would go back to the way they were before this change presented itself. But when you innovate, you see the change and you say, what can be done that has never been done? What can we do that is different? How can we take this challenge or this crisis that we have been presented with as an organization or as an institution and do something that's never been done? To me, that's more of a permanent mentality. Because what if the change doesn't leave? What if the crisis doesn't go? Like, we thought that COVID-19 would be over in maybe in a couple of weeks. It's been here for months. And so those who have adapted are kind of like holding on, only making temporary changes with the hopes that COVID-19 would magically go away. But those who innovate are like, if COVID-19 goes away or if it stays, because I believe COVID-19 is going to be a part of our reality, just like influenza. When it first came, we hope it would go away. Influenza is a part of our reality, like it or not. I think COVID-19 will become the flu one day, where there'll be seasons where we have it. But regardless of if it comes and go, innovators are saying, what can we do differently? And so we don't see changes and crises and challenges as a temporary inconvenience. We see this as a great opportunity to assess our organization, our culture, our operation, our impact, our reach, and say, now with these new set of circumstances, how can we make ourselves better or uniquely different, as Annalie Stanley would say. And you have to really ask yourself, are we trying to be better or the best, or can we be different? And I think you have to kind of look at your organization in terms of your competitive advantage, and begin to kind of engage in some strategic thinking around, should we try to be the best or should we just do something that's completely different? For our ministry, we made the decision to do something different. Everybody had to go online. That wasn't different, but how we presented our broadcast was completely different. We wasn't trying to replicate a church service. We began to do more kind of creative arts, documentaries, roundtables, all sorts of things to communicate the message we wanted to communicate. And it has served us well versus other ministries have struggled with that. The Salvation Army, we realized that we had to innovate in terms of, yes, we had to present our content online, but we had to adjust our content so it didn't feel like you were getting a lecture online. We wanted to be more engaging, more interactive, which means that we had to actually bring our curriculum and design consultant in to sit with us to help us redesign our flow for how we created curriculum. And so by us doing that, I think we have created a much better and different product that our constituents will really appreciate.
One of the things that I've been talking about since the beginning of this is to evaluate everything, because that's my perspective as a program evaluator. And if you don't have a conscious system for making your changes or adaptations, you don't have a system for unmaking them. So document whether it's an adaptation or an innovation, document why you're making a change, and then consider this an experiment, test it, because it might be better, right? Or it might offer advantages that you weren't aware of. But I think that that's a very useful way to think about it.
I like what you're saying about documenting. That's so important, because if you don't keep track of it, then you cannot see, like you said, if it's really useful. And for the people that's involved on your team, when you look at the 4 disciplines of execution, Chris McChesney, he talks about how your team needs to see if you're getting a win or not. And so you're asking people to invest in something that is completely different if you're innovating, or to make a temporary adjustment if you're adapting. They need to see that their labor and their investment, their intellectual property, their contribution, their creativity what is it actually producing? And if you don't track it and be able to show them in a way that's easy to see, then you can create very low employee engagement. You can cause some morale to plummet.
Yeah, morale.
So,
That's
these
what
are
I'm always
things that leaders have to be
reiterating to
thinking about.
people. Evaluation isn't to get anybody in trouble.
Right.
It's so you're doing well, so you know when to stop and have a party. Because if you don't have targets, you don't know when to hit them. You don't
I
know when
like
to celebrate.
So
We're
we
getting,
we have some
Rebecca.
questions. I just
Yeah.
want to get to the questions in the comments. I want to welcome Benjamin and Sandra and Ellen and May. May asks, as I prepare for learning to bring my crisis teams back in September, what are some of the things you suggest for me to change as I lead them back into a fearful scenario of the reality that we have to go back and serve our school communities face to face?
Wow. Thank you, May, for that question. It's a very valid question. I think one of the things you can do to address their fears is to really find out what the actual fears are. Find out what they are afraid of. Find out what they are concerned about, what gives them angst and anxiety. I think a part of it is maybe their dismay at being required to go back face to face in the midst of this crisis versus maybe thinking about a way in which they could continue to teach and provide education virtually. So because that's not the option, they're being told, and maybe they were not even consulted. So sometimes people's fear come out of their feelings about we were not consulted.
Right.
We were not asked what did we think. We were not asked what would be best for us. We're being told what we have to do. And even if you cannot accommodate the suggestions of your team, at least allowing them to share their opinions and trying to really find ways to incorporate their suggestions has a lot to do with how people feel about what they have to do. And so that may be a part of the fear. So being able to engage them to find out, is that what it is? Then if there are actual concerns about going back to the space, social distancing, sanitation, kids being sick, all of these various factors, then begin to say, once I've heard these things, what are things that I know that I can do as the leader to address those fears? And then what are the things that you know is out, is above your pay grade, so to speak? I really cannot do anything about it, but maybe I can talk to the people that can change it. And so you let them know, listen, this is outside of my purview, outside of my managerial or leadership authority. But I can perhaps talk to the person who can make change here and just let them know, here are some concerns. I can't make any promises about that changing, but what I can promise is that I will do all I can to voice your concerns and to advocate for your concerns. And then you have to be aware of what are factors that's beyond anybody's touch. Nothing can be done about this. This is just what has to be done. And then don't just say that you're going to do that, actually execute. Because when you tell your people, I'm going to do these things, and then you don't execute, then you cause mistrust on your team. And we all know the danger of not having trust on a team. So that's what I would say. Just try to see what you can do.
And
actually do
also,
it.
Rebecca, before you bring the next comment up, earlier you mentioned grief and allowing your staff to grieve, because even if they haven't lost anything tangible, they're losing their way of existing. And so letting that go. Rebecca, we have another question.
Yes, we do. Well, May's just saying thank you. She definitely is advocating. She, she can understand fears as a leader herself. And then we had a comment from Ellen who says, and this is big, so it's going to cover our face, so I'm just going to read it off. It says, I'm really enjoying this. David highlights just how complex this new normal really is. Everything needs to be reviewed, and the redesigning of services is both critical and complicated. Needs very conscious thought and development. It's not just going to happen. I think that's a huge takeaway for today. These things are not just going to occur. We really have to set the wheels in motion and put them into place.
I totally agree. It is very complex. And that's why it requires leaders to approach it with humility, to approach it with intentionality, to approach it strategically. And I think it gives leaders an opportunity to reimagine something that they did not have an opportunity. For me, in terms of my ministry, this gave us a reset, a very needed reset. Um, and as easy as that sounds, to hit the reset button, it's very complex. It requires us not being afraid to think about things that we've never thought about, or things that we have thought about, but we were afraid to say, or didn't feel like we had the context that allowed us to say it. And this pandemic has given us all of those opportunities: time to think, time to dream, and time to say some things that may not have been appropriate in our pre-COVID reality.
Mm-hmm.
This has been a fantastic conversation, and I've learned so much. Rebecca, what is your biggest takeaway from our show today?
My biggest takeaway, first of all, Dr. Jackson, thank you so much for joining us. This was fantastic. And we've had good shows, and every time I feel like we say, that was a great show, it's our best show ever. But really, this is dialogue of all of the shows that we've had so far. These themes keep bubbling up, and you're coming here and you're presenting them so eloquently to us to remind us that there's a human element to this, and don't leave that behind. And I just really appreciated you joining us today in this conversation. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Cynthia, what about you? What is your big takeaway?
Well, my big takeaway is I know David personally, and I know all that he has going on. I was there when we learned about how the U.S. was going to respond to COVID. He also trains police officers and has been very active in our civil unrest recently. He also runs a church, and he has time to pick up the phone and talk to me anytime I want, which is awesome. And you know, he always is a couple of steps ahead. He's always thinking of the future, really level head, and I really appreciated that. And that came through today, and that's what leaders are telling us that they're either struggling with or that they know that is their role, is really to plan ahead and take care of your staff. And I love this concept of grief. Let them grieve. So that's my takeaway: level-headedness and letting your staff grieve during this time.
I think that's
Absolutely. Thank you, Sid.
is, and this has come up multiple times, that the people who are doing the work are also living through this time of upheaval and unrest, and thinking so much about how the people who do the work and the work itself are intertwined, and both in need of time and space and care. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Appreciate your thoughts and insights as the rest of us are preparing to go back to work. Have a great day, everybody, and
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.